We regulate our emotions and we get to show up as the man we want to be. We very likely we're much more likely to achieve our objective that way. We're living in alignment with our values. And we don't have to feel regret. We're stepping into the man that we want to become, and having integrity. And I think that's a big one. That we maintain integrity by not letting the emotions guide us. But that said, as you pointed out, it doesn't mean that we are denying the emotion. That there's a place there's a place for that too. There's a place for the emotion to be honored. It's that. And then these two things can coexist, is that we want to honor the feeling and we want to honor the emotion. We want to compartmentalize it, which is not numbing it or denying it, but we don't want to give it control.
All right, everyone, welcome back to The Art of Masculinity. We are kicking off the third part to our series, Stepping In to the Man You Want to Become. I'm here with Frank Paul Vignola. We are jamming out. We had two really good episodes over the past couple weeks. We dove into purpose, what that looks like as a man trying to step into who he wants to become. We went into the second, what we believe, building block to that, which is courage, what it is, what it's not. And now today, we're going to dive into emotions. Now, this isn't going to be your normal emotional conversation. A lot of people have a misconception of what this means for masculinity in men. Everybody wants to be like, oh, it's okay to cry. Well, yes, it's okay to cry. But there is a plethora of emotions that we have that men tend to stuff down, and tend to actually, the ones that are common, they operate from and believe that they're not operating from. So we're going to get into some really cool conversations, maybe something you haven't even heard about regarding emotions and masculinity. So it's going to be very fun. Again, just like the other two episodes, we may push some edges for you guys. We may challenge you guys, and that's all good things. Those are areas that we want to dive into in our own time, in our own introspection, when we find being challenged and see what's behind that. So stepping into the men that we want to become is trying to find that alignment in a man that is comfortable in every environment because he knows who he is. He's created a system within him that allows him to thrive and be authentic in every situation. That's what we're trying to give you guys with this 4 podcast series. And we are in number 3. So if you guys did not go watch the other 2, it's not a prerequisite, but please go back, watch them. It's going to be some of the building blocks that help you when you include what we're going to talk about in this episode 3, regarding emotions. So Frank, welcome back, brother. Thanks, obviously a fun time with you. We've already had some really great conversations. This one is a big one.
It is a big one. I get excited about this one.
Yeah, I know you do. You light up when this, because I know in a lot of your coaching, you attack this. Like you're a bulldog about this.
I am a bulldog about this. You have to remember, I also spent many years acting.
Right.
So, good actors are masters of emotional regulation. We have to be, and I've integrated a lot of my, what I learned in acting into my coaching. So I nerd out over this kind of stuff, especially because this for me is, maybe there's a little sadistic side of me that's like, this is fun because I know it makes the guys uncomfortable, but it's important. It's so important. Guys come to me, and one of the things that they say often is, I need to work on my emotional regulation, and they become very a lot of them are very surprised when I say that emotional regulation also means you need to know how to turn them on. You need to know how to honor them. You need to know how to lean into them and to release them. And a lot of times they're thinking, oh no, I just need to know how to turn mine off. That's not regulation.
No,
that's not regulation. We need to know how to live out our emotions too. Yeah. Sometimes that's the scary part, is leaning into them.
Yeah, and it's recognizing them. It's acknowledging them. It's asking why they're coming up. I mean, emotions are really self-created. Emotions are created by our experiences in life, and we attribute some form of kind of a definition to them, which then sparks an emotional response, right? Like if you're feeling that something's injustice, right? You're probably going to feel anger. You're probably going to feel aggressiveness to defend, to protect. And I say that because, you and I had some long conversations before us. I'm in a season of that right now to a certain extent.
Right.
But to have emotional a response to certain things that are happening, it's got to be related within our psyche. An emotion doesn't just randomly pop up. And then all of a sudden an emotion's there without having kind of a precursor experience to it or some kind of relation to it from life, something that you can relate to it, whether you've seen it in a movie or whether you've experienced it in your life. But those are all the provocations to emotions. And I think a lot of people don't realize that when you actually understand that that's where the emotion is coming from, you really have a lot of governance over it.
We do. In fact, I think that emotional regulation comes in a few different forms. I think that we can regulate the emotion when we're feeling it and when we're experiencing it, and that can be incredibly challenging, but we do have a window between emotion and action where we can regain control and we could be the driver. But I also, to your point, I also think it's important for people to understand that emotional regulation is also looking at what happens before the emotion happens that we do have control over. So one thing that I think is really important for people to realize is, yes, it's the precipitating circumstance, but it's also our belief. It's belief that leads to thought, that leads to the feeling, that leads to the action. And so for example, if there's a precipitating circumstance and something happens where the belief would be, people should not behave this way. People should not do this thing. Then the thought is, somebody did this to me and therefore I have been wronged. And then the emotion is what? Indignation, resentment, hurt, anger, rage, contempt. And then that could possibly, if we're not in control in that window between the emotion and the action, it could determine what action we choose. So saying all that to say, we have a moment between the emotion and the action to do some work, but that's really hard. That's like emotional regulation, level 3, level 4. But where there's a lot of work that could be done. And I think this is something that I like to talk to my guys about a lot, and it's been coming up a lot recently, is really looking at the belief. It's reverse engineering it to what is the belief that's leading to the thought that's leading to this feeling. Because if you can adjust that belief, you might set yourself up to feel that feeling a lot less by adjusting the belief. It takes a paradigm shift. It's a lot of work, but it can be done.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a testament to that being done. Like I, as you know, and as the listeners know, I've lived a whole different life before I got into personal development and podcasting, and there was a whole set of beliefs wrapped in that life. And from those set of beliefs, I would have certain emotional responses to that I had to then shift, which I don't actually now have that same emotional response to those certain things. Which is, it takes a lot of work. And that is just to say, when you focus on it, you have the ability to change that narrative. You have the ability to come into that conversation with yourself, to reframe that belief system, and then to question that belief system as well. And then once you do that, you can really start to make headway in your emotional regulation. So I want to start we've already started, but I want to really kind of bring us to the beginning of this. And the beginning of this for me is really understanding the difference between emotional and logical. Now, we as men, we all want to pride ourselves, guys, on being logical, right? We're the logical ones. And to a fault, and to a certain extent, that is 100% absolutely true. We're solutionarians. We try to create solutions from problems. We see point A to point B, and we try to just go through that through a logical progression of what we've experienced, what we know based on our knowledge, and what makes sense to get us to that point B. So logic is a superpower of men. I will admit that. And I think that when we harness it in the right ways, it is definitely a superpower that we possess. Emotions, not so much. And emotional regulation, not so much. And there is a far cry between the two, and they're both necessary for certain situations we encounter in life. They can be completely dysfunctional if we overuse them in the wrong situation. But when we balance them, when we find those places of balancing them we can actually really expose ourselves to beautiful outcomes, to better understandings of who we are, and to actually acting on behalf of our higher self, right? Which is where I think we want all men to be. And I think that's why we introduced this as the kind of this third part of the series, because now that people can understand a couple of the foundational pieces, the next one is like, how are you actually discerning between logic and emotion and actually calling yourself out when one is not necessary or is the incorrect response in a situation, and then being able to tap in to the correct response to that situation. So I want to dive into emotional versus logical. I'm going to throw my perspective out here, and then we're going to get big old Frank on this. But the first one is emotional. I see a lot of guys react out of emotion. And typically, I think this is the narrative that goes around, like men are just angry, like men are aggressive. They got the testosterone and it forces. But I think for men, it's one of the emotions that we've been permitted to have. We're not highly attuned to the rest of our emotions. It's not something we acknowledge truly. And we don't have a vocabulary for it. We don't understand our emotions in a lot of ways. So what happens is we get into a position of this belief system that then ignites an emotional response, tends to follow sadness or depression or anger, assertiveness, those things. And then when we get into that response system, we actually don't think about that gap that you mentioned. We don't think about, well, what's my action after this, as opposed to letting the emotion drive the action. And I see far too many men, and I was this guy too, especially in relationships, where my emotion would drive the response. And men don't want to acknowledge that they're highly emotional beings. Guys, you are 100% are. It's a fact, but also you guys are operating a lot from emotion. I've seen this repeatedly in my life. And so men are acting from emotion far more than they believe. On the other side of things, we are going into logical, where it's just a solution-based system and it's kind of robotic. And in there, we show no emotion. We show no empathy. We show no consideration. We show no understanding. And that also has caused a detriment. So the two different pieces here are kind of a robotic idea between logic, or from logic, and then the actual empathetic understanding of the human experience, which we would call emotional. I'm going to toss this over to you and hear your perspective on it. But that's what I would say when we talk about versus one another. That's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, I think that's a really good starter for approaching understanding emotions, is being able to start by discerning the difference between emotion and logic, and recognizing that one is not good or bad. It's that it's dependent on the situation, the circumstance, and what it calls for. And there's not always a right or wrong answer. Sometimes it involves another person. Oftentimes it involves another person. So I'm going to give an example of I'm going to give a personal example. So here's an area that I've struggled with, right? So as a coach, I feel like coach is kind of my role in life, not just professionally. I feel like a lot of times this feels like a big part of my purpose, and it's my role in life. But there are times when I need to take that hat off, and I'm a problem solver.
Yeah,
we are problem solvers, so you could probably relate to this a lot. But a lot of times in my interpersonal relationships, I will have somebody sharing something with me. And rather than ask them if let's say that they're venting or they're purging their day to me or a situation to me, rather than asking them, hey, what do you need right now? Do you need emotional support / a hug? Do you need a solution or some tools? Or do you just need some space? You don't need me to say anything. You just need to get it out. And rather than asking them that, I will often put on the coach hat and I will jump to, well, you could do this, this, and that, and then this will resolve it. It's just a very logical, like the electrician.
Yeah.
The electrician looking at a bunch of wires and saying, well, there's the red wire, there's the blue wire, and if you cross these two right here, that's going to resolve that. It's just very objective. It's this very objective, very logical way of approaching a problem, right? And it's like, all right, let's get it solved and move on. That's not what people always need. Sometimes the person is like, I kind of wanted you to just show me some empathy. I wasn't looking for a solution. I can solve my own problem, actually. I really was just in the midst of feeling something that didn't feel good. And I needed that to be validated through your empathy by you just saying like, oh man, yeah, that would have really pissed me off too. Wow. Yeah, what the fuck?
Yeah.
You know, like just having that kind of response of just kind of stepping into like, let me step into my empathy and my compassion right now. This is a time for emotion. This is a time for emotional Frank. This is a time for me to get into the trenches with you and just sit there with you and not resolve anything and let you know that I'm on your level and validate what you're feeling and be like, yo, I get you. In fact, something similar happened to me not too long ago. And yo, I felt the same way, you know, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that's it. And then we can climb out together, or you could do it on your own. But that's a time where logic is not called for. And I wouldn't know that unless I asked.
Right.
Unless I asked. And this can come up in coaching. In coaching, it's a little bit different because typically I feel as though you've hired me and you know what reasons you've hired me for. But even within that, within the coaching structure and the conventional coaching approach, there's still times where a client might be like, yo, I was kind of hoping for you to just give me a hug, metaphorically speaking, you know, a virtual hug on this one. That's really just what I needed. I did not need a solution. So this is good for people to, I think this is good for people to hear. It's something I'm still working on and I still work at consciously, is to ask the other person, the client, the loved one, what do you need from me right now? And B, to also be willing to ask for what it is that I need when I'm the one who is venting, is that it's okay for me to say and to give clarity and say, hey, by the way, just so you know, I'm venting. I don't need any solutions from you. I really just wanted you to kind of like let me know you get where I'm coming from, just a little bit of emotional support. Or on the flip, listen, I'm not looking for your pity or sympathy right now. I don't need any of that. I want tools. I want a solution. So we can take the responsibility of doing both, is we can, and that will help us discern emotion from logic, because without getting feedback from the other person, I don't see, well, maybe you can give us an example of a time where, I don't know, can you think of a time where we can determine based on judgment which one is needed? Versus having to, I'm putting you on the spot, versus to having to ask the other person.
Yeah, I can tell you right now. So just assume if you're doing this with a woman, they don't want you to solve the problem. that's my answer. No,
9 times out of 10.
9 times out of 10.
Yeah,
They've already actually solved the problem a lot of times, and they just want you to hold space.
Or they're not interested in solving it.
No, or
they just want to keep talking about it. Yeah.
So no, but in all seriousness, I would say this is a great question. So one of it is practicing your emotional intelligence. And the way that I tell people to practice their emotional intelligence is revisit your life and revisit certain aspects of your life when something happened that was a common thing, like someone talked shit about you that was close to you. And you're like, man, that really made me feel this way. Okay, so if someone's coming to you and Frank's coming to me and he's venting about someone talking shit about him behind his back that was a close friend, I can immediately tap into my knowledge of how I've made it feel or how I felt in those moments. And then I can project. You got to be very careful projecting, but you're going to be far closer to the right answer of response for that person if you project the idea of how you felt when that happened, as opposed to saying, Frank's a guy, I'm going to be logical, right? So for me, it's about building your emotional intelligence so you can start to read people. Now, I have an extensive experience with body language, with tonality, with vocabulary, with eyes, with facial expression. All of those things are incredibly helpful to determine, okay, what does Frank really need right now? But if we're going to go just very basic layman terms to start your emotional intelligence awareness, think about how you have felt in moments and then utilize that emotional identification to project onto somebody else that's doing that's in a similar scenario, and use that to calibrate your response. You might be off, and that's okay, but you're far likelier to be on than you are off, as opposed to just assuming a very base level, like he's a guy, he needs logic, she's a woman, she needs support, emotional support. Sometimes women, I ask my wife now, and what you said was incredibly powerful, and I hope everybody really heard what you said. That question of what do you need?
Yeah.
provides two things. It provides, one, the person to voice what really is going to help them in that moment. And what we originally talked about, which was that belief, which engages in emotion, and then there's a gap to the response. It allows you to interject in that gap for yourself. So then the response doesn't become emotional, it becomes predicated off of how you want to show up in that scenario, whether it's logical or emotional. But it gives you that moment, that brief moment. In the military and special operations, we called this a tactical pause when we were on an objective. But you're taking a moment called a tactical pause that's allowing you this micro window of creating a very intentional decision and response to that situation. So don't underestimate the power of asking that simple question: how can I best support you right now? Or what is it you need from me in this moment, right? Like, that is incredibly powerful. And I can lend so many stories to this, but I'll kind of wrap this part up with a story about, like, just my wife. She's taught me this so much. I was always problem solving, former military leader everywhere I've been, highest levels of that. Okay, I'm a problem solver. I'm very good at it. I can see all of these different paths when you bring something to me. She was not happy with that, to say the least, on multiple occasions, and rightfully so. I wasn't giving her what she needed, right? And in that moment, it happened. I overstepped my boundary multiple times, as many men can relate to. And I had this clarity after kind of just revisiting my responses to be like, how can I make this more amicable, where I'm actually giving her what she desires and I'm not trying to play a guessing game and stepping all over myself. And that came out to, hey babe, real quick, how can I best support you in this moment? When they get into their spiel of whatever's going on in their life, it's like, pause right there. Hey, how can I best support you right now? And then vice versa. It taught me to ask her, when I would go to her, I'd be like, babe, I'm just venting. I don't need anything from you. It prompts me to give her a successful response to me as well, whether it be logical or whether it be emotional. So don't underestimate the power of what Frank said. That is something I think every man should write down in their journal right now.
We're not mind readers. No. I think that it's really important that we remember that. That was something that was really powerful that was taught to me, and that's why I've held on to it so much, and I've been kind of reminding myself of that and talking to my guys about it as well. I like what you said about emotional intelligence and one of the ways to build it. I think it's a great way to build. I refer to it as, we maybe use them interchangeably at times, but I think that that's a great way to build empathy, is to find the closest thing in your life that you've experienced that you think would parallel what the person is telling you about, and then it will help you identify what they're feeling. Yep. But there's still that moment of being able to identify what they need, and that's where we're not mind readers. And that's where we have that opportunity to ask and say, what is it that you're looking for right now? And I know you want to move on from this, but before we do, I want to give them, I want to give them an example. And if you have one, please chime in, of a time when we know that logic is actually going to benefit us, and problem solving is going to, maybe something in the workplace. It could happen in interpersonal relationships as well, where we want to achieve an objective and it's not time to be emotional, even though we feel angered by a person or hurt. Maybe something in the military, but an example where logic, because I think we landed on times coming up with questions, but we kind of highlighted a situation where in most instances, they're wanting the emotion and we're bringing logic. So now let's maybe give them an example of the opposite, which is a time when logic is probably required and we were getting ready to respond emotionally. Yeah,
absolutely. I have ran my own events, and my wife has ran her own events for many years now. And a lot of times when you're running an event, there are unforeseeable circumstances, right? And so for me, I can give this perspective is like, I'm in a moment when I'm running a men's event where all of a sudden we're having external forces to the event kind of play a big role in how the event's unfolding. For example, when I was running my events down in Corpus Christi, you would get days of really saturated rain. And when that happened, the ground was so muddy The ground, it was so sticky and muddy that like you literally couldn't go do what we wanted to do. And either you were going to get a car stuck, or the guys weren't going to be able to do their move and shooting like they wanted to, or you couldn't get the helicopter up for whatever reason because the weather could be bad, whatever, wind or potentially lightning and thunder. So you had these external elements that kind of dictated. And what happens in those moments is the logic needs to come in, because you have to be adaptable and create the solution, which is, okay, I can't do this, but let me dive into my logical response of what's my other options right now to give these guys a really cool experience that is applicable for me to do. And then how do I execute that? Emotion can't come into play, because at that point, if you're thinking emotion, you're like, how's the guys going to feel that they don't get to do this? What are they going to be thinking about? Are they going to judge me? Are they going to judge the event? And all of a sudden you go into a tailspin of shit that's irrelevant, because at that moment you still have to deliver something to them.
Right.
And so in those moments, you've got to play with what you know and come up with a logical process to get them what it is that's going to be fun, what it is that's going to let them feel the experience you want them to have, and what it is that's going to get the job done to get you to the next step within the program, whatever it is you're throwing. So when I was, when we were coming up with, ideas to kind of create solutions to that scenario, we had to completely shut out the emotion, especially me being the guy that was running it. I'd have to brainstorm with my buddy Nick, who was helping me run that event, and we'd have to come up with solutions, but I couldn't think about what they were going to think about me or of the event, because then it's like, then I'm going to be on eggshells with them later on, and I'm not going to feel confident in my own event, and it's going to cause a whole tailspin of other things that don't need to happen in that moment, and then deteriorate the event far more than it could have been, even if it was at all. But it was going to deteriorate my performance in the event because I'm thinking about this emotional response from them. Yeah. So that is a clear example of when emotion almost has to get removed and logic is the sole answer to the question.
That's a good one, and I think that that's one that a lot of people listening can relate to, just in terms of a work situation, where, and I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, okay, what are some of the emotions that Johnny may have felt or somebody might feel in a situation like that? Well, one, probably some frustration. Two, a little bit of helplessness, perhaps. Three, maybe a sense of dread. Oh, fuck. Right.
Fear.
Yeah, panic, fear, defeat.
Yeah.
This is going to fucking crumble, and there's nothing I could do about it. All of these things, which could lead to so many different actions if we were to act on those things. You could have canceled the whole thing.
Well, I mean, it would even cross my mind sometimes. It is like, okay, we're having all these things come into play. Let me ask the guys what would be good for them.
Right.
But you just brought these guys here for a good chunk of money to put on an event for them. And the last thing they want to do is be making decisions. And not to mention, the last thing that they may actually be good at is making decisions. They might not be full-blown leaders that can make good quality decisions when they're put on the spot. So now you're also then giving governance of your own event over to them based on, let me respond to their emotions. Instead, it came down to me as the leader to say, cool, this isn't working. These are the other avenues. Let me pick the best one I think is going to work, and let me just execute and disregard the emotional conditioning of like, okay, let me think about how they're feeling. Let me think about how I'm feeling. Take all that into consideration. It wouldn't serve the purpose. It wouldn't serve a purpose for me in that moment. And there was a lot of things swirling around. So absolutely, you hit the nail on the head.
That's a good one, because also that would be a perfect situation where you would come home to your wife and be like, I want to vent about all these feelings that I felt. And by the way, I don't need a solution because I already solved it. Now I just want to vent. And this is where I want your emotional support to kind of validate all those fucking things that I was feeling. So, all right, man, cool. Good shit.
And that logical thing too, I mean, it comes up all the time in relationship. Another example I'll give you guys is like, Taylor and you and I talked about this. Taylor and I travel a lot, right? And you can relate this because you travel a lot.
I do,
And you get to a foreign country, you may or may not speak the language, and all of a sudden, like, things get a little chaotic, and maybe something's not going to plan. Maybe something is far different on the ground than what you expected. So you get to the plan that you thought was correct, And then all of a sudden your plan gets thrown for a loop because the things around it are not actually as you believe they would be, right? I know that seems a little kind of abstract, but essentially if you came to a location, say for instance, we're in Greece and we're going to like the Parthenon, and all of a sudden we get there to get tickets and a guide, and the guide doesn't show up. What do? Right? All of a sudden you're thrown for a loop, and you could be mad. You could be like, where's my guide? I already engaged with this person. They didn't show up, or I can't find them because there's a sea of people around this. Like, what am I going to do? I don't have their number. They said just to meet them here. Like, I don't have service. All of these things come into play. Well, we travel a lot. Those things have happened. And when it comes to that moment of things swirling around and chaos kind of ensues, boom, it's got to be a logical response. You got to say, okay, how do I create the best solution right now without acknowledging the emotional things that are going on? Because that's not going to solve the problem, where is we need to execute our day, or we need to execute this part of our day. Let's create the solution. And then from there, once we're in a more, I would say, less emotionally volatile environment, then let's acknowledge the emotional state of that. Let's vent about it. Let's have the conversations around that. But in that moment, you can't do it. In that moment, it's not going to happen. And Taylor and I have experienced this so many times traveling the world.
It happens so much during travel.
Yeah.
And it can happen over the littlest things. It can happen because you left something at home that you really needed.
Right.
You know,
I
and
don't
then
have toothpaste right now.
Right.
My
We were
wife
just
took it
talking
out of
about that.
my wife took it out of my toiletry bag.
Or a charger.
Yeah, or a phone charger. It's just these little things where those moments, logic is the pronounced solution for that scenario, for you guys to get through it, and then move into the emotional response or emotional regulation after you can get through that and you get into a more peaceful kind of environment. So that's definitely another one. So for all you guys out there, there's a little bit of a business one, a little bit of a relationship one. But the other thing that we kind of touched on, and I want to really attack as well, is like how we let emotions really dictate actions. Like, this is a big one, because when you have an emotion dictating an action, you tend to be misaligned. For me, and we can go into numerous stories on it, but for me, if I'm going to convey this to you guys as the listeners, what this looks like is essentially making an emotional response to, say, for instance, your partner, and they're having a rough day and they're fucking wound up and they're going off the handle, right? And all of a sudden your emotional state spikes. Maybe you feel like you're being attacked because they're angry, but they're not angry with you. And all of a sudden you start saying shit and reacting based on that emotional feeling. I find this happens a lot with guys, and guys that I've coached have been very honest about it. That's one of their biggest problems, and gets them into arguments all the time in their relationship. And the bottom line is they're responding in a completely misaligned way, because they don't want to create an argument. They don't want to create a fight with their spouse or their girlfriend. They want it to be peaceful. They want to support them the best they can. But because their emotions dictated the action, they were unaware of how to enter into their higher self and respond that way.
100%. And, anger is the number one emotion that wants to be satisfied in the moment. It's that
Feels so good.
It does. It does. And it's very likely that if we respond to this, emotions are ephemeral. They're fleeting. Even anger. But it's very likely that if we let an emotion guide our next action, that it's going to be misaligned with one of two things. Either one, our objective of that particular circumstance or situation, or one of our values. Is that we're living misaligned. We're out of alignment with one of our values. So if we value patience, if we value gratitude, if we value self-mastery, if we value grace, there's so many different things that we could be out of alignment with if we respond to this fleeting feeling of frustration, rage, indignation. These are all kinds of anger. And they want to be satisfied. They badly want to be satisfied in the moment. It really feels good.
It's so gratifying.
It is. It is, and they could be they could be gratified through different things. We could we could physicalize it, but usually in our interpersonal relationships, it's verbal. And it takes a significantly less energy to just say the words that we so badly want to say, and therefore it's very challenging to bite our tongue.
Yeah, absolutely.
To bite our tongue, but the consequence is that we're misaligned. The consequence is that that's a fleeting feeling of satisfaction, and then we become misaligned. And I think all the examples that we just gave before, the work example that you gave, the example with the travel example, the travel example, the example with the men's retreat or the men's event, and the example that you just gave with an argument. In any one of those situations, if we were to have let the emotion guide our next action, very likely it would not have helped our travel.
No.
If we reacted in a way that was in alignment with our anger. Well, fuck all of this. Or whatever.
Be pissed off.
Yeah, I'm gonna go pick a fight with my wife now.
Or I'm gonna go yell at the travel person behind the desk, right? Like they have nothing to do with it. Like it's not their fault.
Or the men's event. You might have done something that was a reaction to fear or insecurity, and that would have been out of alignment with your objective. It would have been out of alignment with your value of leadership. Because you wouldn't have taken charge, and those guys would have felt that. Because then the decision would have been on them. And then in the argument with a loved one, if somebody hurts us in the moment, it might feel really satisfying to hurt them back. That's what we want to satisfy, is the need for revenge, to let them know you hurt me and you can't get away with that. But it's likely not in alignment with our objective of the situation, which is to either end the argument, not have the argument, or a number of values. So there's consequences to letting our emotions guide our actions.
Absolutely. And those emotions, while they serve a really good purpose to be acknowledged, they should not be the driving force behind the action. The default is what I'm trying to say. They shouldn't be the default, because the emotion also needs to be reviewed before the action is taken. Now, the emotion may actually be the right response to the situation. It could be that anger is an actual appropriate response to this. But if you allow the anger to be the response without questioning it in that brief moment before the action happens, that's the thing we want men to stop doing. Because when men can start evaluating the response and making the intentional response of, is it logical or is it emotional I need right now, then you start to enter into those situations where you actually achieve the outcome you want. And also you at least present yourself in the way that you're good with, because that's the thing. Like, God, dude, I can't even tell you how many times, like it was part of the reason actually I probably stopped drinking as much, right? Because it was like and guys, you all can relate to this. It's like you'll be drinking, you'll be having fun at like a party, you're fucking hammered. And then you remember the next morning, like, did I really say that dumb shit? Or did I really do? And it may not have been anything like super significant, because I never did anything like super, super inappropriate. But I'd remember a conversation, I'd be like, God, that was really fucking stupid. Like, I really say that shit? And then you're like, man, that's kind of embarrassing. And so you're in that moment of like, oh, dude, I kind of regret the guy I showed up as in that moment. I'm not proud of him, and I don't really want to feel that way anymore. But the same thing goes when you're sober, because you enter into these reactions where you're all of a sudden treating your wife like shit. And you're like, that's not the person I need to be mad with. I'm not proud of a man that treats his wife like shit verbally because I felt attacked in that moment. Like, that's not my enemy. Right. And so guys then regret that. And then you start living that life of regret because you have the inability to emotionally regulate yourself and to discern what's the appropriate response in that moment.
Yeah. We regulate our emotions and we get to show up as the man we want to be. We very likely we're much more likely to achieve our objective that way. We're living in alignment with our values. And and we don't have to feel regret. We're stepping into the man that we want to become, and having integrity. And I think that's a big one. That we maintain integrity by not letting the emotions guide us. But that said, as you pointed out, it doesn't mean that we are denying the emotion. That there's a place there's a place for that too. There's a place for the emotion to be honored. It's that, and then these two things can coexist, is that we want to honor the feeling and we want to honor the emotion. We want to compartmentalize it, which is not numbing it or denying it, but we don't want to give it control. We don't want to let it drive the car and drive our next actions. We want that to be guided by us. We're the switchboard operator. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight what you had just said a moment ago, is that there's, we're still honoring the feeling. We're still allowed to have it. Yeah.
But we also have to have that value system that you and I have been talking about since the first episode of the series. That value system is kind of that key indicator of, okay, is my response inappropriate? Is my response misaligned? If I don't have that value system, and I think this is where a lot of guys are struggling right now, is they don't have that value system. And so they know that they don't feel good about like the way they responded or the way they've continually responded, but they don't know why.
Right.
They just kind of inherently know, like, it feels a little crunchy.
Feels misaligned.
Yeah, it feels misaligned.
I can't say why.
But I don't know why.
Yeah.
And if I don't know why, I don't know how to fix it.
Right.
Right. And then I continually just perpetuate the problem because I can't figure out where it is that I need to go to the switchboard and turn something off or turn something on or replace a wire, whatever it is. Right. And that to me is where the work has to begin, which is that value system that you have so eloquently spoken about numerous times. Is like, we got to start building that in so that when we get to this point of emotional regulation, we get to this point of logic, the value system aligns. And then from there,
it's a roadmap.
Yep, it is. It's our guiding light. It's our, a good friend of mine likes to use the term a lighthouse, right? Being a lighthouse. It's your lighthouse. Your value system is your lighthouse. That's how you get across to people who you really are. And that is the one thing that guides you to saying, hey, this is the man that you want to show up as. Keep following it. You might be really far back. You can barely see it, but it's still there. And it's going to keep you on that correct path.
Because once again, we are our actions.
Yep.
We are our actions. To the world, we are nothing else.
Oh, that's so
You can have
important.
murderous thoughts. We all do, actually. We do. But it's our actions that matter. That's it. And that's what you're right. They're a roadmap. I say roadmap, but I like lighthouse too. The values are a roadmap or a lighthouse to guide us to the actions that are going to be aligned with the man that we want to be. And don't worry about what you're feeling. Honor it that you're feeling it, but don't judge yourself for it, and don't let it guide your action.
Absolutely. And that's
it's easier said than done.
Oh, for sure.
There's a methodology to becoming great at this.
Yeah, everybody listening, don't think like Frank and I are like masters of this. We work through this shit just as much as you guys. We've gained a lot of the tools along the way, and that's what we're trying to impart.
And we're still not perfect at it.
No, fuck no. I messed this up. I still ask my wife. I'll still step into the logical role far less than I used to, but I will still step into it sometimes. And then I'll have to back out of it, right? Like I have the awareness now to be like, oh shit, that was the wrong way. Let me back up, rewind.
Or every once in a while, we have to check ourselves because we're being ruled by an emotion.
Right.
I have this driving force to do this, and I'm finding a way to justify it to myself. But if I dig a little bit deeper and I call myself out, I'm finding that my ego is bruised, or I'm finding that I'm upset by this, or I'm taking this personal and I don't need to be. And then I need to revisit everything and approach it logically and say, I can't justify this action anymore.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, you can ask my wife. There's times that I'll go back to her and just be like, hey, babe, I'm really sorry. That was an incorrect emotional response that I took out on you that had nothing to do with you. And I apologize that, it was perceived in a way that I did not mean it to be, where it seemed attacking you. Like I've gone back and said that to my wife numerous times because we're human. We're fucking human.
Exactly.
But the best thing is when we have these kinds of tools, when we have this kind of awareness, we can make corrections, man. And a lot of times that's all it takes is just, we talked about it on one of the other episodes. It's that 1 degree of difference, right? Like that 1 degree of difference when you get out to 1 mile is 17 degrees off from where you started. That's a big difference in your path. And if we can continue to be aware of that and make the corrections, that starts us on that 1 degree of difference, right? It's different than how we would have done it the day before. And that's where the progress really happens. But you said something that was really important that I want us to really start to dive into as well, which is the denying emotions is not regulation.
It's the antithesis of regulation.
Go.
Yeah.
What is that?
It's so a lot of guys have this misconception of emotional regulation. They've read a lot of Stoicism, and shout out to the Stoics out there. It's all good. There's a lot of good in there.
Absolutely.
But they a lot of them have the misconception that it is not having emotion or that it is numbing your emotion. And I want to point out that numbing emotion is the antithesis or the opposite of emotional regulation. The operative word is regulation. We're regulating. It means we're achieving a moderation, is that we need to know when to not use the emotion and not let the emotion guide our actions, maybe compartmentalize it a little bit. We also need to know when to turn the emotions on. We need to know when to access our empathy or even when to just let ourselves feel something that's making us really uncomfortable. There's a bravery in that. There's a courage in that, in being able to cry.
Yeah.
For example. Yeah. This is something that guys still struggle with.
Yeah.
A lot of guys still struggle with this. And I remember in acting, so when I was I was in a few acting conservatories, and I knew, man, the one thing that's holding me back is, I have these things that I wanted to work on, but the one thing that I knew that was really holding me back from being the actor that I wanted to be was I still wasn't able to turn the tears on. I wasn't able to access them. And I didn't know what it was from. Was I afraid to cry in front of my class? It was like a part of me was shut off. And I think that a lot of people listening can probably relate to this, is that men have a tendency of doing this, but women can do it as well. But men, it seems to happen with a lot. Either there's this, conventional conventions of society has kind of taught us, and nurturance has taught us that we're not supposed to cry, or if we've been hurt a lot of times, we think we're regulating our emotions and we go into some survival instinct of just shutting them off and numbing them, and then we become unable to access our tears even if we want to cry. It's like this brick wall has been built up. And that was a big part of my journey as an actor, is being able to poke at that wall, and it took a while. First it was like, oh, if I fondle this brick or this stone, it got a little bit loose. So I loosened a stone. That's a step in the right direction. It took a while of me, prodding and probing for it to eventually come crumbling down, and for me to be able to access tears in a way where if I want to at any point, I can lay on my floor, go into a meditation, play one song, and I can have a meltdown.
Wow.
I can have a full-on meltdown, and it's fucking cathartic.
Yeah.
It's like taking a shit. It's like taking a really big shit. You know what I mean? Like, I say this to my guys. I say this a lot when guys are grieving, is I say that having a really good cathartic meltdown is like taking a really big shit. We're not meant to hold on to it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it can actually feel very cleansing.
Oh, yeah.
And you feel lighter. You feel lighter afterwards. But for a lot of guys, it's like, okay, conceptually, I love that, but I don't know how.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So would you say that emotional regulation is putting yourself in a position to have some kind of personal action that allows the release of emotion? Is that kind of what you?
We have triggers.
Yeah.
We have triggers, and I know that's a buzzword these days, and it's
You
one.
triggered me with that trigger.
Yeah, right.
word.
Yeah. It's triggering. But it's. We often associate it with something negative, but there's positive triggers.
Yeah.
So a positive trigger would be one that we use for something like this, is I know my triggers. Frank the actor and just Frank the human. I know my triggers. I know my songs. I know my movies. I know my videos on YouTube. I know words. I know all the different things that I know thoughts, all the different things that I could pull up that are my triggers that are gonna move me. That's an actor's journey. But it's also a human's journey who wants to learn how to really become a master of their emotions, is that you can do the same thing. Anyone else can. And your triggers are not going to be the same as mine. Yours might be somewhere in the military. Somebody else's might be something with their kids. Somebody else's might be something that's rooted in a past trauma. We all have our own triggers. And sometimes it could be a song. Is that if we associate a song with a certain time of our life, that's a beautiful trigger.
Oh my God,
because it's like, it's like a key.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, now I don't actually have to go into a meditative state. I could just play the song and that's my trigger. It could be an inanimate object that was something that was given to you by a loved one that passed away. There's so many different things that can be a trigger to be able to access that.
To trigger yourself into that emotional state that is going to be a release
Yes.
for catharsis.
Yes.
But it can be an action, right? So it's like, for you, it's like you could put the song on in a quiet place at your home and then break down in a cry and have this cathartic release of a lot of different emotions and then be super recalibrated and set after that, right? Or someone could do I can't remember the name for it right now off the top of my head. I think it's abstracting is the name for it. But it's like you have this conversation with a past person that has hurt you or you feel has hurt you. But you can do that all on your own and
through like a guided meditation
no, just kind of like sitting on your own in your room, and you can basically play the position of them and what they would say and play the position of you, and you do this repeatedly for a few different times. And you can put a pillow down in front of you, and that can allow you to do like screaming release or hitting the pillow or whatever it is. All of those are cathartic releases for emotions in which you can then recalibrate yourself. And you allow you get reset, and then you actually can go about your day or about your week, about your month, where you're far more calibrated and regulated emotionally. So where you're not being led by an emotion for reactions, right? You're not allowing yourself to be swept in the emotional state when something else happens down the road, and then you're not thinking about it before you act. That's
absolutely. And I think that really embodies being the master of the switchboard. Is that the switchboard is being the operator of the switchboard doesn't mean you just turn all the switches off and then walk away. You got to be able to turn them on, off, midway. Is that really the switchboard operator? I think that's the place that we want to get to in regulating emotions, is that we are a master of our emotions. We know when to compartmentalize them, but we also know when to fully lean into them. And then there's this whole gray area in between that we can access as well. Yeah. And I know that that's incredibly challenging for men. On the one end of the spectrum, you pointed out that men are way more emotional than they believe they are.
Absolutely.
And that they need to learn how to compartmentalize that and gain control over that. On the other end of the spectrum, men have a hard time accessing certain emotions and owning those emotions, and that's a big struggle, particularly for our gender. But we can do it.
We have the ability, and it just takes the ownership of saying, okay, I acknowledge the fact that Johnny, Frank, you guys are right. I can look in a lot of areas of my life and be like, yeah, I acted very emotionally in that. Most of you guys listening right now could probably think to something you did today. If you're listening to this episode today that you reacted emotionally, that you're like, oh shit, like, yeah, I totally did that. Or acted logically when that wasn't the right answer, right? I'm sure every guy listening right now can think to that moment, even in this day. And for me, when we can acknowledge that stuff, that's the path to, for a lack of better term, recovery. That's the path to change. That's the path to development. You got to first see what it is that you're not happy with, acknowledge it, and then you can start to say, now I can make some changes. I can get better. We talked about that a little earlier. You gotta have you gotta understand the values to know when you're misaligned. Well, you gotta understand the results of the emotional response, the results of the logical response in the inappropriate times to know why you don't want to do it, to know what needs to actually change. And what really gets me, because again, I experienced this through a lot of my life in before I got on this journey. And that was the fact that when you are unregulated, that's not manly. It's not manly to be unregulated and walk around like some fucking tough guy in a bar who doesn't know how to control his emotions. It's not sexy to women to watch a dude be unregulated in his household with his kids and with her. It's not fucking attractive for a dude to be unregulated in his life in general. And it creates a level of unsafety, lack of safety for anybody.
Yeah.
Right. Like even in a men's community, if you have the inability to regulate yourself and to provide the kind of not necessarily the correct, but the appropriate for the situation, right? Like if you're reading the situation, the appropriate response to the situation, if you have no ability to do that, guys are not going to want to be in a small group with you. Guys are not going to want to call you on the guys trip because they're like, well, Frank just becomes a fucking dick, man. Like every time I try to open up about my struggles with my family, he just becomes a fucking asshole. Like, and it's like, because Frank can't emotionally regulate. So Frank gets into his response system that is not thoughtful and it's unintentional. Right. And it's not saying he's a bad guy. It's just like, he just doesn't have it, but it's not manly to be that way.
No.
And when it comes to women, especially, I learned this with my wife, the whole safety thing. It's not physical safety, guys. They know, like, majority of you guys could protect them physically. Like they understand that. What they're talking about is that emotional safety. And a man who cannot regulate himself is not emotionally safe. And that causes a lot of problems.
Yeah, preach, brother.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, I love what you said, that it's not manly, because it's like, you're calling them out. And I love that, because it's not manly. It's not cool. It's not impressive. It's not sexy.
Yeah, none of
it's
it.
not attractive. It is not a badge of honor.
No.
And to anybody who has done the work and who has learned to regulate their own emotions, to somebody who has done that, you look like an adult having a temper, it looks like an adult temper tantrum, essentially. You know, if you are so dysregulated that you're letting your temper get the best of you and you're having a screaming fit, if you think for a second that looks tough, or that's how you embody toughness or machismo, by letting your by being like, yo, my temper's don't fuck with me kind of thing. That's not impressive to me, bro. I'm not impressed at all. So as your bro, I'm not impressed, and I'm sure most women are not going to be impressed by that. And the ones that are, well, whatever.
Yeah, but they got their own emotional issues.
Right, exactly. They might need to hold themselves to a higher standard. So, it is, but yeah, no, being emotionally dysregulated and is essentially, these types of outbursts. So I know that that's not the only example that you gave, but it was one, that having that type of like, throwing a fit kind of outburst, and thinking that looks like machismo. Again, to anybody who has learned emotional regulation, it looks like emotional immaturity.
Yes.
It looks like an adult temper tantrum. It looks like you have the emotional regulation skills of a child. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing that it looks like. It looks like you are unevolved and underdeveloped. So if you think that epitomizes masculinity, then you have a very warped understanding of what masculinity is. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So so good for you for starting that call out. I thought I'd piggyback on it.
Yeah,
and call
no,
it out
it's
even
great,
more.
because it's not manly. And for me, I can say that because the times when I look back in my life at when I thought I was like this pinnacle of this alpha male, but I was unable to emotionally regulate, especially when it came to interpersonal relationships, intimate relationships. In the world, I could regulate enough to do things very well, to solve problems, to execute leadership, all these things. But in my personal life, with that lack of ability to emotionally regulate, I ended up with a divorce. I ended up, with my own areas of like sadness and, dare I say, maybe even my own depths of depression, right, in moments and times. And so when you dive into that, it's all of this inability to regulate, and you're not safe. You're not even safe for yourself. And that's all to say that there is a path out of that if you acknowledge the fact that it's not manly to be in that state. It's not manly to carry around this inability to understand the emotions that come up, why they come up, how to deal with them, how to let them out appropriately, when to let them out appropriately, the cathartic releases like you were talking about. All these things play a role into your life, and they should. And if we are so disassociated from understanding them, we'll never have the ability to actually incorporate those tools to then be healthy men, to be that healthy masculine. And I'll say one last thing is like, think about the kids, but think about the children, man.
Yeah.
Like if you're not emotionally safe, those kids are not going to ever feel safe, and they're going to carry that trauma into their adulthood, and they're going to go be seeing a coach or a therapist to figure out how to get past that, because you could not be an adult. You could not take ownership of your own shit and then start to say, oh, yes, I'm a man, and yes, there's improvement for my emotional regulation. Let me start to work on that. And so the children are the ones that end up burdening your inability to do this. And when they burden that, they perpetuate the cycle because they see that that's what a man is supposed to do or believe that's what a man is supposed to do.
That's where we learn emotional regulation.
Right.
We learn it as children. We learn it from our parents. Yeah, man.
So good, brother. Well, guys, this is wrapping up the third installment to this series around emotions. I hope that you guys gain some great wisdom and knowledge that you'll be able to implement into your life from our conversation here today. And hopefully this is a new kind of aspect of looking at emotions. It's not just the crying thing that everybody wants to say. There's so much more to it than that for us as men and for masculinity in general. So hopefully this gave you guys a really good perspective that you can roll into your life from here on out. And I will say, as I've mentioned before, stay tuned, guys. We have something we're going to be presenting to you guys at the end of this series where you're going to be able to participate with Frank and I in an environment, a very curated environment and container where we're going to work on a lot of these things with you guys. So stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for what's coming up after this series that we're going to follow up with for you. And make sure you guys tune in for the final episode next week on stepping into the man that you want to become. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Frank, as always, a pleasure, brother.
Absolutely, brother.
See you guys on the next one.